The year was 1874, and the winter seemed unwilling to loosen its grip. Upon the northern counties of England, evening descended early over the little industrial town where Eliza Carter lived, covering rows of soot-darkened brick houses beneath a veil of mist and coal smoke. Gas lamps flickered along narrow streets slick with rain, their pale circles of light trembling upon wet cobblestones. Chimneys stretched into the gray sky like silent sentinels, and from the mills came the distant rhythm of machinery that rarely slept. In a modest terraced house near the edge of town, a 17-year-old girl sat beside a fading fire and listened to the wind against the windowpane. Eliza Carter possessed neither wealth nor influence, yet there was a quiet dignity about her. Her brown hair was neatly pinned, despite the long day she had endured, and her thoughtful eyes carried a seriousness uncommon in one so young. Only a year earlier she had still attended the local school, cherishing borrowed books and dreaming of a future larger than the streets she had always known. She had loved reading by candlelight in the evenings, imagining distant cities, grand houses, and lives untouched by poverty. But dreams often surrendered quickly before necessity in Victorian England. Her father had died the previous spring after a brief illness. 1 week he had been walking to the ironworks each morning, and the next he lay silent beneath the churchyard earth. His wages vanished with him, and the burden of survival settled heavily upon the family. Since then, Eliza's schooling had ended. Her books remained stacked upon a shelf, gathering dust while she searched for work. On that evening, rain tapped gently against the glass while her mother mended a worn sleeve by candlelight. The room smelled faintly of coal smoke and damp wool. Neither woman spoke much. Words were precious when worries were many. At last a knock sounded at the door. Eliza rose and opened it to find Mrs. Holloway, a neighbor whose cheeks glowed pink from the cold air outside. The older woman carried news. The Whitmore family, owners of the largest textile mill in town, required another servant for their grand house on the hill overlooking the valley. The position offered food, lodging, and a small wage. It was not generous work, but it was work. Later that night, long after the neighbor had departed, Eliza lay awake, listening to the distant whistle of a railway engine drifting through the darkness. Beyond the town, trains carried travelers toward Manchester, York, London, and places she had only seen upon maps. She wondered what waited for her beyond childhood, beyond grief, beyond the narrow boundaries of the life she knew. As the fire faded into glowing embers and fog gathered beneath the gas lamps, she could not know that the following morning would begin a journey that would shape the next decade of her life and lead her toward joys and sorrows she had never imagined. The following morning arrived beneath a sky the color of worn silver. A thin fog drifted across the valley, softening the outlines of mills and chimneys that rose above the town. Eliza left her home shortly after sunrise, her small bundle of belongings tucked beneath her arm. The streets were quiet except for the distant rumble of carts carrying coal and the occasional whistle from the railway line beyond the river. The air smelled of damp stone, smoke, and rain that threatened to return before evening. As she climbed the winding road toward Whitmore House, she could not help glancing back at the rows of modest houses below. They seemed smaller from the hillside, almost swallowed by the mist. Ahead stood the residence of the town's wealthiest family. Its tall windows reflected the pale morning light. Ivy clung to sections of the stone walls, and iron gates guarded the entrance to the grounds. To Eliza, the house appeared less like a home and more like something from the pages of the novels she once borrowed from school. A stern housekeeper named Mrs. Fletcher greeted her at the servants' entrance. Without wasting a moment, she led Eliza through a maze of corridors polished to a shine. The floors seemed to stretch endlessly. Portraits of long-dead ancestors watched from gilded frames. Every clock ticked with quiet authority. By midday, Eliza had already begun her duties. There were fireplaces to clean, silver trays to polish, carpets to brush, and countless stairs to climb. The work was harder than she had imagined. Yet she remained silent and determined. Each coin she earned would help her mother survive. Days soon settled into a rhythm. Before dawn, she rose from her narrow bed in the servants' quarters. Long after darkness covered the town, she finished her final tasks. Sometimes she caught sight of the Whitmore family gathered in brightly lit rooms where crystal chandeliers sparkled above elegant dinners. Their laughter drifted through half-open doors while servants moved like shadows around them. One rainy evening, nearly 3 weeks after her arrival, Eliza was carrying fresh coal to the library. The room glowed warmly beneath lamplight. Shelves filled with books lined the walls from floor to ceiling. As she knelt beside the fireplace, her eyes lingered on the volumes. For a brief moment, she forgot her duties. A voice suddenly spoke from across the room. "You enjoy books, I think." Startled, Eliza looked up. Standing near the window was a young gentleman she had not seen before. He appeared only a few years older than herself. His expression held curiosity rather than judgment. Before she could answer, the rain tapped softly against the glass, and the great clock in the hall began to strike the hour, marking the first moment that would quietly alter the course of her life. Several moments passed before Eliza found her voice. The young gentleman remained beside the tall window, where rain traced silver paths across the glass. Beyond him, darkness had already begun to gather over the valley. The lamps of the town flickered faintly through the mist below, while the distant mills stood like great shadows against the evening sky. "I do, sir," she finally answered. "Or at least I used to." A faint smile appeared upon his face. "Used to?" he asked. Eliza lowered her eyes at once. She feared she had spoken too freely. Servants were expected to work, not converse. Yet something in his manner seemed different from the stern formality she had come to expect from the household. "There is little time for books now," she replied softly. The young man nodded as though he understood. He stepped toward one of the shelves and ran his fingers across the worn spines of several volumes. "That is a pity," he said. "A person should never lose the habit of reading." For a moment neither spoke. The fire crackled gently behind her. The room smelled of old paper, polished wood, and coal smoke. It was one of the warmest places in the house, and, to Eliza, perhaps the most beautiful. At last the gentleman introduced himself. His name was Edward Whitmore, the eldest son of the family. He had recently returned from Cambridge and was only visiting before traveling south again. The name alone reminded Eliza of the distance between them. He belonged to the world upstairs. She belonged below. Yet Edward asked questions no one else ever asked her. He wanted to know which books she had read and what subjects she had enjoyed at school. To her surprise, she found herself answering. When the hall clock struck once more, she realized nearly 15 minutes had passed. Suddenly, the door opened and Mrs. Fletcher appeared. Her sharp eyes moved immediately from Eliza to Edward. The housekeeper said nothing, but her expression alone was enough. Eliza rose quickly, gathered her coal bucket, and hurried from the room. That night, she lay awake in the servants' quarters listening to rain drumming upon the roof. Around her, the other maids slept soundly. Yet sleep would not come. She kept remembering the library, the warm glow of the fire, and the unexpected kindness in Edward Whitmore's voice. Outside, wind moved through the trees surrounding the great house. Somewhere in the darkness, a clock struck midnight. Eliza told herself she would likely never speak with him again. Gentlemen and servants occupied different worlds, and Victorian England guarded those worlds carefully. Yet, as the storm clouds drifted slowly across the moonlit sky, fate was already preparing another meeting, one that neither of them could foresee. The days that followed passed beneath the curtain of rain and drifting fog. Autumn was slowly surrendering to winter, and each morning the grounds of Whitmore House seemed colder than the last. Frost gathered upon the iron gates before sunrise, and pale clouds hung low above the valley where factory chimneys poured endless streams of smoke into the sky. Eliza continued her work from dawn until late evening, yet she found herself looking forward to the quiet hours when she might be sent to the library. The room had become a refuge from the endless clatter of household duties. There, among the shelves and the warm glow of the fireplace, she could almost remember the girl she had once been before hardship entered her life. Edward Whitmore appeared often during those evenings. Sometimes he sat reading near the fire while rain tapped gently against the tall windows. Sometimes he wrote letters at a large mahogany desk covered with papers and books. Their conversations began cautiously. A few words exchanged while she dusted a shelf. A brief question about a novel. A remark about the weather. Yet, with each passing week, the distance between silence and friendship seemed to grow smaller. Edward spoke of Cambridge, of history, and of cities Eliza had never seen. He described London with its crowded streets, grand buildings, and endless rows of gas lamps stretching into the night. Eliza listened with quiet fascination. In return, she spoke little of herself, though Edward seemed interested even in the smallest details of her life. One evening he handed her a book. It was a worn volume of poetry. "You may borrow it," he said. Eliza hesitated. "I should not, sir." "Then consider it a temporary rescue," he replied with a smile. Books dislike being left unread. Night she carried the volume to her small room beneath the roof. Long after the other servants had fallen asleep, she sat beside a candle, reading beneath its gentle light. Outside, wind rattled the window panes while clouds drifted across the moon. For the first time in many months, she felt something she had almost forgotten: hope. Yet, not everyone in the house failed to notice these encounters. Mrs. Fletcher watched carefully. So did several of the servants. Whispers began to circulate below stairs whenever Edward's name was mentioned. Eliza tried to ignore them. She reminded herself constantly that he was the son of the master and she was only a servant. Victorian society was built upon such distinctions. Everyone understood them. Everyone respected them. Everyone except perhaps the heart itself. One cold evening in December, snow began falling over the valley. White flakes drifted past the library windows, while the fire burned brightly within. Eliza was returning a book to its shelf when Edward stepped beside her. For a brief moment neither spoke. Then he asked a simple question that would linger in her thoughts for many days. "Have you ever wished your life had been different?" Snow continued to fall throughout the evening, covering the grounds of Whitmore House in a blanket. of white that seemed to silence the entire world. Beyond the tall windows of the library, the trees stood motionless beneath their icy burden, and the distant town below glimmered faintly through the winter mist. The warm light of the fire danced across the shelves of books as Elisa considered Edward's question. Have you ever wished your life had been different? It was such a simple question, yet no one had ever asked it before. Most people concerned themselves only with what her life was, not what it might have been. She lowered her eyes and clasped her hands together. Every day, she answered quietly. Edward did not seem surprised. He stepped closer to the fireplace and gazed into the flames. So do I, he said. The admission startled her. To Eliza, Edward possessed everything a person could desire: wealth, education, comfort, and opportunities that stretched far beyond the valley. She could not imagine why he would long for a different life. Sensing her confusion, he smiled faintly. People often mistake privilege for freedom, he said. They are not always the same thing. The words lingered in the room long after they were spoken. Outside, snowflakes drifted slowly through the darkness, while the great house settled into evening silence. During the weeks that followed, their conversations became more frequent. They spoke of books, history, and distant places neither of them had visited. Sometimes Edward read passages aloud, while Eliza dusted the shelves. Sometimes she shared memories of her school days and the dreams she had once carried. Those moments felt strangely removed from reality, as though they existed in a world separate from servants, masters, and social expectations. Yet reality always returned. Each morning, Elisa awoke before dawn to scrub floors and polish silver. Each evening, she climbed narrow staircases carrying coal and firewood. Whenever she caught sight of herself in a mirror, dressed in a servant's plain uniform, she remembered exactly who she was. Christmas arrived beneath gray skies and bitter winds. The Whitmore family hosted guests from neighboring estates. Carriages rolled through the gates, from morning until night. The grand dining room glowed with candlelight while laughter echoed through the corridors. Servants worked harder than ever. On Christmas Eve, after a long day of duties, Eliza slipped briefly into the library. The room was empty. Upon the desk rested a small package wrapped in brown paper. A card lay beside it. Her name was written carefully across the front. With trembling hands, she opened it. Inside, she found a beautiful leather-bound book of poems. There was no signature. There did not need to be. As she turned the first page, a gentle smile touched her lips. Yet beyond the frosted windows, unseen by both of them, the first shadows of future sorrow were already beginning to gather. The winter deepened as January settled over the valley. Each morning, the fields surrounding Whitmore House lay beneath frost, sparkling faintly beneath the pale light of dawn. The town below seemed wrapped in permanent smoke and mist. Factory whistles echoed through the cold air before sunrise, calling hundreds of workers toward another day of labor. From the library windows, Eliza often watched their small figures moving through the gray streets. Many looked no older than herself. Some were children. Victorian England was filled with such sights, though few among the wealthy gave them much thought. Life within the house continued, according to its familiar rhythm. Fires were lit before breakfast. Floors were polished. Meals were served beneath crystal chandeliers. Yet for Eliza, the weeks passed differently now. Edward had become a constant presence in her thoughts. She looked for signs of him without meaning to. A voice in a corridor, footsteps upon a staircase. The sight of him crossing the snow-covered grounds, One evening she entered the library to find him seated beside the fireplace. The flames cast a warm glow across the room, while shadows danced upon the ceiling. A thick fog pressed against the windows, hiding the world beyond the glass. "You look troubled," Edward said. Eliza hesitated before answering. "My mother has been unwell." The words escaped before she could stop them. Almost immediately she regretted speaking. Personal concerns were not matters for discussion between a servant and her employer's son. Yet Edward listened carefully. "Is it serious?" he asked. "I do not know." He nodded thoughtfully. For several moments neither spoke. The fire crackled softly between them. At last Edward rose and crossed to the window. "When I was a boy," he said quietly, "I believed that money protected people from sorrow. The older I become, the less certain I am." Eliza looked at him, but said nothing. There was a loneliness in his voice she had not noticed before. In the weeks that followed, winter storms swept across northern England. Snow gave way to cold rain. Railway services were delayed. Roads turned to mud. News arrived that several mills in neighboring towns had reduced production. Because of poor trade, workers feared losing their wages. One evening, Edward showed Eliza a newspaper article discussing economic difficulties in London and Manchester. She understood little of business, yet she understood hardship. Hardship was a language spoken by every poor family in England. As February approached, a subtle change settled over Whitmore House. Letters arrived frequently for Edward. He spent long hours reading them. Sometimes he appeared distracted during their conversations. Sometimes he seemed far away, even while standing in the same room. Eliza sensed that something was coming, though she could not explain why. Outside, rain tapped gently against the library windows, while a train whistle echoed across the dark valley. February arrived beneath endless gray skies. Rain swept across the valley almost daily, turning roads into rivers of mud and leaving the bare trees glistening beneath cold winds. The warmth of Christmas had faded completely from Whitmore House. The guests had departed. The decorations had been packed away, and the grand hall seemed quieter than before. Yet beneath the surface of daily life, something had changed. Eliza felt it whenever she entered the library. Edward was no longer as carefree as he had once appeared. Letters continued arriving from London. Sometimes he spent entire afternoons reading them beside the fire, his expression growing increasingly troubled. One evening, as dusk settled over the countryside and fog gathered outside the windows, Eliza found him standing alone near the shelves. The fire burned low, casting long shadows across the room. He turned when she entered. For several moments, he said nothing. Then he spoke quietly. "I shall be leaving soon." The words struck her with unexpected force. Though she had known this day would eventually come, hearing it spoken aloud made it suddenly real. She lowered her eyes and focused upon arranging books upon a table. "For London, sir?" she asked. "Yes." His voice carried little enthusiasm. "My father wishes me to spend more time there. There are opportunities waiting. Business matters. Political connections." Eliza nodded. Such things belonged to his world. They always had. Outside, rain tapped softly against the glass. Somewhere in the distance, a train whistle echoed through the evening mist. The sound seemed strangely mournful. "When will you leave?" she asked. "In 3 weeks." 3 weeks. The number settled heavily between them. Neither spoke for a time. The library felt larger than usual, as though the silence itself had expanded. At last Edward stepped closer. "I shall miss our conversations." Eliza, hearing her name spoken so gently, caused her heart to quicken. She looked toward the fire, afraid that her feelings might reveal themselves. "I shall miss them as well." "Sir?" The formal title sounded colder than she intended, yet Victorian England offered few alternatives. During the days that followed, the approaching departure seemed to cast a shadow over every meeting. They continued, speaking whenever opportunity allowed, but an unspoken sadness lingered between them. Eliza found herself noticing small details she had previously overlooked. The way Edward smiled when discussing books, the thoughtful expression that crossed his face while reading, the kindness that seemed so rare among men of his position. One rainy evening, he handed her a folded sheet of paper. It contained a short poem copied carefully in his own hand. "Something to remember me by," he said. Eliza accepted it without speaking. She knew she should not keep such a thing, yet she also knew she never intended to part with it. Beyond the windows, darkness covered the valley, while gas lamps flickered far below in the town. March arrived with restless winds and cold rain that swept across the northern countryside. The snow had vanished from the hills, leaving behind fields of dark earth and swollen streams. Around Whitmore House, bare branches rattled against windows during the night, and heavy clouds drifted endlessly across the sky. Edward's departure was now only days away. The knowledge hung over Eliza like a gathering storm. She carried trays through silent corridors, polished silver in empty dining rooms, and climbed endless staircases, while the same thought followed her everywhere. Soon he would be gone. One evening, a violent rainstorm struck the valley. Thunder rolled above the hills, and lightning briefly illuminated the great house. Most of the family had retired upstairs. The servants hurried through their final duties before seeking shelter from the weather. Eliza had been sent to secure several windows in the east wing. As she crossed a narrow corridor, she noticed a figure standing alone near a large window overlooking the valley. It was Edward. Beyond the glass, rain lashed the darkness. The distant lights of the town flickered beneath layers of mist and smoke. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Edward turned toward her. "I leave on Monday." The words felt heavier than before. Eliza lowered her eyes. "I know, sir." The title sounded painfully formal. A flash of lightning filled the corridor with pale light. "You need not call me sir when we are alone," he said quietly. Her heart began to race. Victorian society was built upon rules. Invisible walls separated people from one another. Yet standing there in the half-darkness, listening to the storm beyond the windows, those walls seemed less certain. "I shall miss you, Edward." The words escaped before she could stop them. Silence followed. Not an uncomfortable silence, but one filled with everything neither dared say aloud. Another roll of thunder echoed across the valley. Edward stepped closer. "So shall I," for the first time. Neither pretended there was no feeling between them. Outside, the storm raged across the countryside. Rain hammered the glass. Wind swept through the trees. Somewhere far below, a railway engine sounded its mournful whistle as it disappeared into the darkness. Without thinking, Eliza looked up. Their eyes met. In that moment she forgot the servants' quarters. She forgot the polished floors and endless duties. She forgot the vast difference between their stations in life. For one brief, dangerous moment, she saw only the man she had come to care for. Then footsteps echoed somewhere along the corridor. Both stepped back instantly. Reality returned. The spell was broken. Neither spoke again. Eliza hurried away, her cheeks flushed and her heart aching with emotions she scarcely understood. That night she slept little. Wind rattled the roof above the servants' rooms while rain continued falling across the valley. And as darkness slowly gave way to dawn, Eliza realized something she had been trying not to admit. She was no longer simply fond of Edward Whitmore. She had fallen deeply in love with him, and before the month was over, that love would change her life forever. Monday arrived beneath a sky of low gray clouds. Before sunrise, a cold mist settled across the valley, covering the fields, the railway tracks, and the chimneys of the distant mills. Whitmore House seemed unusually quiet that morning. Even the servants moved through the corridors with subdued voices, as though the weather itself had stolen the warmth from the day. Eliza awoke long before dawn. Sleep had visited her only in brief and restless moments. Every tick of the clock had carried her closer to Edward's departure. Now the day had finally come. She dressed slowly in the dim light of a single candle and listened to the wind moving against the roof above the servants' quarters. Somewhere below, a door closed. A carriage wheel rattled over stone. Time was slipping away. Throughout the morning, she struggled to focus on her duties. Trays felt heavier. Corridors seemed longer. Every glance through a window revealed the same drifting fog that covered the grounds. Shortly before noon, she saw the family gathered near the entrance hall. Travel trunks stood ready beside the door. Servants carried luggage to waiting carriages. Horses stamped impatiently upon the wet gravel outside. Eliza remained hidden near a side corridor, watching from a distance. She knew she should not be there, yet she could not stay away. At last Edward appeared. He wore a dark traveling coat and carried gloves beneath one arm. For a brief moment he seemed to search the hall for someone. Then his eyes found hers. Across the crowded entrance, their gazes met. Everything else seemed to disappear. The voices, the footsteps, the servants moving around them. For one silent moment there was only the painful certainty of goodbye. Edward stepped away from his family and crossed the hall. No one stopped him. No one spoke. Eliza felt her heart pounding as he approached. "I wished to see you before I left," he said quietly. She struggled to answer. "I am glad you did." Outside, the coachman called for departure. Rain began to fall once more. Small droplets tapped against the tall windows overlooking the drive. Edward hesitated. Then he reached into his coat pocket and placed a small object into her hand. It was a silver locket, simple, elegant, precious, beyond anything she had ever owned. "For remembrance," he said. Eliza's eyes filled with tears she dared not shed. "You will write," she whispered. A faint smile touched his face. "I promise." Another call came from outside. This time there could be no delay. Edward stepped back. Neither moved. Neither spoke. Then, with one final glance, he turned and walked toward the door. Moments later, the carriage rolled away into the mist. Eliza remained standing long after it disappeared from sight. The rain continued falling. The valley vanished beneath fog. And as the sound of departing wheels faded into silence, she felt as though something precious had been carried away with them. Yet unknown to Eliza, this farewell was not the end of their story. Spring arrived slowly, though little warmth accompanied it. Weeks passed after Edward's departure, and Whitmore House settled back into its familiar routines as though nothing had changed. The clocks continued ticking. The servants continued working. Carriages arrived and departed. Yet for Eliza, the house no longer felt the same. Every corridor carried a memory. Every glance toward the library awakened a quiet ache within her heart. At first, she lived for the letters. Each morning she watched for the post. Each afternoon she hoped her name might be called. Then, one rainy evening in April, a letter finally arrived. Her hands trembled as she opened it beneath the candlelight of her small room. Edward wrote of London. He described crowded streets filled with carriages, grand buildings hidden beneath fog, and railway stations alive with travelers from every corner of Britain. He wrote that he missed their conversations and often thought of the quiet evenings spent in the library. Eliza read the letter 3 times before sleeping. For the first time since his departure, she smiled. More letters followed. Not many, but enough. Each became a treasure she carefully hid among her few possessions. The distance between them seemed smaller whenever his handwriting appeared before her eyes. Summer approached. The hills surrounding the valley turned green. Wildflowers appeared along country roads. Yet beneath her happiness, another reality slowly emerged. At first, Eliza dismissed it as exhaustion. Servants often worked themselves beyond their strength. Long hours and little rest were common. But as the weeks passed, she began noticing changes she could not explain. Her appetite disappeared. Mornings became difficult. A constant weariness followed her through each day. Fear arrived gradually. Then certainty. One evening she sat, alone in her small room beneath the roof, and stared silently at the candle burning upon the table. Outside, rain drifted softly against the window. Far below, the lights of the town shimmered through mist. Eliza knew. Deep within her heart, she knew. Tears slowly filled her eyes. She was carrying Edward's child. The realization left her breathless. Part of her felt joy. Another part felt terror, unlike anything she had ever known. In Victorian England, an unmarried servant with a child faced ruin. Respectability was everything. Without it, doors closed forever. For several days, she told no one. She moved through her duties like a ghost, haunted by thoughts she could share with nobody. Then fate intervened. One afternoon, Mrs. Fletcher summoned her to the housekeeper's office. The older woman's expression was colder than Eliza had ever seen. A letter lay upon the desk. Beside it stood Mrs. Whitmore herself. In that moment, Eliza understood. Somehow they knew. The room seemed to grow smaller around her. Her future, which only months earlier had seemed uncertain but hopeful, was suddenly hanging by a thread. The moment Eliza entered the housekeeper's office, she knew her life at Whitmore House was over. The room felt colder than the rainy afternoon beyond the windows. Mrs. Fletcher stood beside the desk with her, hands folded tightly before her, while Mrs. Whitmore remained seated in a high-backed chair, her expression stern and distant. The letter lying upon the desk seemed small, yet it carried enough weight to destroy everything Eliza had struggled to preserve. No one invited her to sit. No one offered kindness. The silence itself felt like a judgment. At last, Mrs. Whitmore spoke. Her voice was calm, almost emotionless. She informed Eliza that certain facts had become impossible to ignore. Rumors had reached the household. Observations had been made. Questions had been asked. Eliza listened without interruption. There was little point denying the truth. The room seemed to blur around her as the reality settled deeper into her heart. Mrs. Whitmore asked only one question. Was her son responsible? For several seconds, Eliza remained silent. She knew the answer would change everything. She could have spoken Edward's name. She could have explained the promises, the letters, the affection they had shared. Yet even now she could not bring herself to expose him. "No, madam," she whispered. The lie left her lips before she could reconsider. Mrs. Whitmore studied her carefully. Whether she believed the answer or not remained impossible to tell. The older woman simply nodded. The decision had already been made. Eliza's employment would end immediately. No recommendation would be provided. No future position would be arranged. She would leave the house within 48 hours. The words fell one after another like stones into deep water. In Victorian England, a servant dismissed without a reference faced almost impossible odds. Respectable households depended upon recommendations. Without one, employers assumed the worst. Eliza understood this perfectly, yet she said nothing. Pride was often the final possession of the poor. That evening she returned to her small room beneath the roof and packed her belongings. The task required little time. A few dresses, several books, Edward's letters, the silver locket. Outside, rain drifted across the dark grounds while wind moved through the trees surrounding the estate. Downstairs, life continued as usual. Dinner was served. Fires were lit. The wealthy remained warm while the unfortunate prepared for uncertain futures. 2 days later, Eliza stood at the gates of Whitmore House with a single suitcase beside her. The sky hung low and gray above the valley. Smoke drifted from factory chimneys in the distance. She turned once and looked back at the great house upon the hill. It seemed larger than ever, distant and unreachable. Somewhere inside those walls remained memories she would carry forever. Then she faced the road ahead. She had nowhere certain to go. No position. No protection. And soon she would have a child to support. As cold rain began to fall once more, Eliza started walking toward the railway station, unaware that her next destination would be London, and that the hardest chapter of her life was only beginning. The railway station stood beneath a curtain of cold rain when Eliza arrived 2 days later. Smoke drifted beneath the iron roof, mingling with steam from waiting locomotives. Porters hurried along the platforms, pushing carts piled with trunks and parcels. Travelers in dark coats moved through the crowd, while gas lamps cast trembling reflections. Upon the wet stone floor, Eliza clutched her suitcase tightly and stood alone among strangers. Behind her lay everything she had known. Ahead waited London. The journey south seemed endless. Rain streaked the carriage windows as fields, villages, and factory towns slipped past beneath the gray sky. Sometimes she watched distant church spires emerging from the mist. Sometimes she stared at her reflection in the glass and wondered what future remained for a young woman carrying a child and possessing almost nothing else. By evening, the train finally approached the capital. London revealed itself slowly through smoke and fog. Endless rows of brick buildings stretched toward the horizon. Railway lines crossed one another like dark threads. Chimneys rose everywhere. Thousands of windows glowed through the gathering dusk. The city seemed larger than anything Eliza had ever imagined. When she stepped onto the crowded platform, a wave of noise surrounded her. Voices echoed beneath the station roof. Horse-drawn cabs rattled outside. Newsboys shouted headlines. Steam hissed from locomotives preparing for departure. No one noticed her. No one cared where she had come from. For the first time in her life, she was completely alone. The following weeks proved harder than she had feared. Her small savings disappeared quickly. She rented a narrow furnished room in a worn building near the East End. The wallpaper peeled from the walls. Rain leaked through the roof during storms. The fireplace consumed more coal than she could afford. Each morning she searched for work. Again and again she heard the same question. Do you have a reference? And again she was forced to answer no. Doors closed immediately. Employers lost interest. Opportunities vanished before they could begin. At last she found occasional work as a laundress. The pay was poor. The hours were long. Her hands became red and cracked from endless washing. Yet it was enough to buy bread and keep a small fire burning during cold evenings. As spring turned toward summer, her pregnancy became impossible to hide. People noticed. Some looked at her with pity. Others with judgment. Victorian society could be merciless toward women in her position. One evening she returned to her room exhausted after a day of labor. Rain drifted beyond the window, while fog rolled through the narrow streets below. She lit a candle and sat quietly beside the fading fire. From her suitcase, she removed Edward's letters. For several minutes, she stared at them without opening a single one. No new letter had arrived for months. The silence from London. Society's promising young gentleman had become impossible to ignore. As the candle flickered beside her and darkness filled the room, a painful question finally entered her heart. What if Edward Whitmore was never coming back? Summer arrived over London, yet little warmth reached the narrow streets. Where Eliza lived, the city remained wrapped in its familiar haze of smoke, dust, and endless noise. Horse-drawn omnibuses rattled across crowded roads. Factory whistles echoed. Through the mornings, thousands of lives passed one another each day. Without a glance or a word, among them moved Eliza, carrying a burden that grew heavier with every passing week. By August her savings had vanished completely. She worked whenever work could be found. Some days she washed linens in steaming laundries from dawn until dusk. Other days she mended torn clothing for a few pennies by candlelight. The labor exhausted her, yet she had no choice. Every coin mattered now. Every loaf of bread mattered. Every piece of coal mattered. As her child grew within her, simple tasks became more difficult. Stairs left her breathless. Long hours standing over washtubs brought pain to her back and shoulders. Yet she rarely complained. There was no one to hear her complaints, even if she had. One rainy evening she returned to her lodging and discovered a letter waiting upon the hall table. For a brief moment her heart leaped. Perhaps it was Edward. Perhaps at last an explanation had arrived. With trembling fingers she carried the envelope upstairs, but the handwriting was unfamiliar. The letter came from her mother in the north. The news inside struck harder than any disappointment. Her mother's health had worsened. Work was scarce. Money was desperately needed. Eliza sat beside the window. Long after finishing the letter, outside, rain flowed down the glass, while gas lamps flickered along the street below. She wished she could help. She wished she could return home, yet she possessed barely enough to survive herself. For the first time since arriving in London, hopelessness settled heavily upon her heart. Weeks later, on a cold September night, labor pains began. A fierce storm rolled across the city. Rain hammered the rooftops. Wind howled through narrow alleys between the buildings. Alone in her room, Eliza struggled to remain calm. Fortunately, an elderly widow living downstairs heard her cries and rushed to help. Through the long hours of darkness, the storm continued raging beyond the windows. Church bells marked the passing of midnight. Then 1 o'clock, then 2. At last, shortly before dawn, a child's cry filled the room. Eliza wept openly as the tiny infant was placed into her arms. A son, her son, the first pale light of morning slowly appeared beyond the rain-soaked window. Exhausted and overwhelmed, she gazed down at the sleeping child wrapped in a worn blanket. In that moment, something changed within her. The fear remained, the poverty remained, the uncertainty remained. Yet for the first time in many months, she possessed a reason stronger than sorrow she would endure. Whatever hardships awaited, she would survive for him. As London awakened beneath gray skies and drifting fog, Eliza quietly whispered the name she had chosen. The years passed more quickly than Eliza would have believed possible. Seasons came and went across London. Winters covered the city in cold fog and smoke. Springs brought brief bursts of sunlight to narrow streets lined with brick houses. Summers filled the air with dust and noise, while autumn rains darkened the cobblestones beneath thousands of gas lamps. Through it all, Eliza worked. She worked when she was tired. She worked when she was ill. She worked when hope seemed distant. And always, she worked for Thomas. The little boy grew strong despite their hardships. By the age of 5, he could already read simple words. By 7, he spent evenings beside the fireplace, with borrowed books resting upon his knees. Eliza often watched him while mending clothes by candlelight. In those moments, she was reminded of herself as a young girl before. Poverty and disappointment had altered the course of her life. Their room changed several times over the years. Sometimes they lived in cramped lodgings near the East End docks. Sometimes they rented small rooms above crowded shops. None were comfortable, yet each felt a little more secure than the last. Slowly, through endless effort, Eliza built a life from almost nothing. London itself was changing. New railway lines expanded across the city. Stations grew larger. Factories multiplied. Horse-drawn traffic crowded the streets from dawn until night. Great wealth flourished in districts like Westminster and Mayfair, while poverty remained only a few miles away. Eliza witnessed both worlds. On some days she cleaned elegant townhouses where crystal chandeliers glittered above marble floors. On others she walked through neighborhoods where entire families lived in single rooms. One cold evening during the winter of 1884, after Thomas had fallen asleep, Eliza stopped at a small bookseller's shop on her way home. A newspaper hanging outside caught her attention. A familiar name appeared in the headline: Edward Whitmore. For a moment she could not breathe. She purchased the paper with one of her precious coins and hurried home through the fog. There, beside the fading fire, she read every line. Edward had become a respected public figure. He was now a member of Parliament. Newspapers praised his speeches and his growing influence. His photograph accompanied the article. He appeared older, more confident. Every bit the gentleman society expected him to become. Eliza stared at the image for a long time. A strange calm settled over her. There was no anger left, no bitterness, only distance. The young man from the library seemed to belong to another lifetime. Across the room, Thomas slept peacefully beneath a worn blanket. Slowly, Eliza folded the newspaper and placed it aside. Her life had not become a fairy tale. She had not been rescued. Yet looking at her son, she realized she possessed something far more important. She had survived, and as another winter wind moved through the streets of London, A new opportunity was quietly approaching, one that would determine the future of the boy sleeping beside the fire. The winter of 1885 arrived beneath heavy skies and drifting fog. London seemed wrapped in a gray blanket of smoke and mist, its gas lamps glowing softly through the darkness like distant stars. Rain tapped gently against countless windows across the city while horse-drawn carriages rattled over wet cobblestones. Inside a modest room, not far from one of the great railway lines, Eliza Carter sat beside a small fireplace and watched her son prepare for work. Thomas was no longer a child. The thin, curious boy who had once fallen asleep beside borrowed books had grown into a thoughtful young man. Through years of sacrifice, long hours, and endless determination, he had earned an education far beyond what many expected from someone of his circumstances, and now, at last, he had secured a clerk's position with a railway company. It was not a grand title. It did not bring wealth or privilege. Yet in Victorian England, it represented something precious: respectability, stability, opportunity, a step upward. A better beginning than the one his mother had received. Eliza watched as he adjusted his coat and gathered his papers. The firelight danced across the room while wind whispered softly beyond the window. For a moment she saw traces of both herself and Edward in his face. The realization no longer brought sadness. Time had softened old wounds. Thomas kissed her cheek before leaving for the station. "I shall return before supper," he said with a smile. Then he disappeared into the fog. Eliza remained beside the fire long after the door closed. The room felt peaceful. The years of struggle seemed distant now, though she remembered every one of them. The hunger, the loneliness, the endless labor, the fear of an uncertain future. She had never become a lady. She had never returned to Whitmore. House Edward Whitmore remained a respected gentleman, living a life entirely separate from her own. They never met again. Yet as she stared into the glowing embers, Eliza understood something that had taken more than a decade to learn. Success was not always found in grand houses, titles, or fortunes. Sometimes it lived quietly in small victories, in surviving when survival seemed impossible, in continuing when hope felt lost, in giving a child opportunities that once seemed beyond reach. Outside, a train whistle echoed through the evening fog. The sound carried across rooftops and vanished into the London night. Eliza smiled softly. The world continued moving forward, just as it always had. The fire crackled gently, shadows danced upon the walls, and for the first time in many years, she felt content. Thus ends the story of Eliza Carter, not a fairy tale, but a very Victorian tale of endurance, sacrifice, and quiet courage. If you enjoyed spending these evenings beside the fire, wandering through foggy streets and candlelit rooms of 19th century England, do not forget to subscribe, leave a kind comment, and join us again for another journey into the past. Until then, may your evenings be warm, your fires burn brightly, and your dreams carry you gently through the misty streets of Old England.